Hello again. This lecture is on Islamic conceptions of evil, especially as they emerge out of the Islamic scriptures of the Quran. Now, 50 years ago, it might have been a pretty curious thing to have a lecture on Islamic conceptions of evil in a course like this. Why, one might have wondered, would you want to talk about Islam? How relevant is that to a Western understanding of evil? In the past 50 years, we've come to realize that Islam is an intrinsic part of the history of Western thinking on evil in complicated ways. First of all, Islamic thought was deeply influenced by earlier Greek, Jewish, and Christian thinkers. And so to understand Islamic thought reveals things about those earlier traditions that might otherwise go missing. We might not be able to see as well in them as we can by seeing them through the prism of Islamic thought. Secondly, Islam was itself the source of the transmission of much pre-Christian literature and philosophy, especially Greek philosophy, to Western Christendom, which also picked up a good bit of insight on a series of important topics from Islamic philosophers and lawyers themselves. Third, Islam serves in a way, like Rabbinic Judaism, as a kind of internal critic of the mainstream of Western thinking about evil, a critic that is both within and without this mainstream. It serves as a useful contrastative opinion to the main line of thinking that these lectures follow, but also it serves as a vital account that it has its own integrity, even if it is somewhat oblique to that mainstream. Because of this, you could almost call this class, this lecture, an exercise in comparative Satanologies. Now let me start by mentioning some uniquenesses about the Islamic account that are really important for this lecture. The Quran is unique among the scriptures of the Abrahamic faiths in explicitly rendering the episode of the origin of evil in creation by recounting the rebellion of Iblis, the rebellious spirit. Some Islamic thinkers call Iblis an angel, some call Iblis a genie. Iblis is the one who becomes a shaitan, right? The primordial rebel against God. Now, before I get going into the details of the story, though, it's important to say just a little bit about the background of the Quran, because it's a very complicated and very fraught topic intellectually and theoretically today. Now, the Quran is the sacred text of Islam, but one should be careful about how one frames that. The Quran is not per se the Muslim Bible. Yes, it's roughly as long as the Christian New Testament, and it's similarly divided into sections. There are 114 surahs, that is chapters, in the Quran, and each of those surahs is composed of verses called ayat, which is also translated as the word sign, right? Each of the verses, thus, of each of the surahs of the Quran is a sign of God's providence and love towards humanity. So far, so good. It looks like another holy book. But the similarities can mislead in some important ways. Much as the Christian New Testament is not the Christian Bible as opposed to the Jewish Bible of the Hebrew Scriptures, the New Testament, right, stands in complicated relationship to the Hebrew Bible, which is more or less identical with what Christians call the Old Testament. Similarly, the Quran is complicatedly related to both Torah and the Christian Bible, New Testament and Old Testament. First of all, Islam respects the sacred books of both the Jewish and Christian traditions, suggests it claims, in fact, overtly claims, that those books themselves contain significant dimensions of God's revelation through the sending of the prophets of God, and Islam incorporates significant segments of the narratives of both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament into its teachings, and at times the stories themselves appear slightly differently told in the Quran. Secondly, the Quran is not quite the same thing as a Bible. A Bible literally comes from the Greek word the book. The Quran literally means the recitation. The Quran is the revelation accorded to Muhammad, transmitted to him by the angel Gabriel. And Muhammad then would go and recite it to his followers and to rivals and other people interested in the towns. It was written down, actually, only in bits and pieces during Muhammad's life. And then it was only compiled, collected, organized, and fixed textually only after his death, and canonized in the form that we have it, it seems to be, by Uthman, the third caliph, who ruled about 25 to 30 years, 20 or so years after Muhammad's death. Now, the vast majority of Muslims across the centuries have believed the Quran to be the perfect record of what the Archangel Gabriel recited to Muhammad as God told him to recite. The Quran is composed entirely of exceptionally powerful lyric poetry, some of the most beautiful Arabic poetry ever written. Now, in a way that's different from the Torah and the Christian New Testament and Old Testament, the Quran itself is sacramental, a material means of holiness, a way of participating in God, in some sense more akin to the Christian Eucharist, the ritual of communion, the Lord's Supper, than to the Christian Bible or the Torah, the Jewish Torah. The Quran is the word of God for Muslims, but in this case, it is somewhat akin to how Jesus is the word of God for Christians, because the Quran was recited by God to Gabriel in Arabic. In other words, there's no distance whatsoever between the content of God's message and the linguistic form in which it exists in the Quran. Now, we know for a fact that Jesus didn't speak Koine Greek, and yet the New Testament that we have is in Koine Greek. In other words, the language of Jesus already had to be translated. So not even Jesus' sayings do we have exactly as they were said in the day that they were. And at no point do Judaism or Christianity suggest that God is speaking in the language of the people who are writing down the texts. That's not the way these traditions think about God's revelation. But in Islam, it's very clear that the poetic form and the linguistic form of the Quran are exactly what God meant to give his people. At one point in the Quran, God says, I have given you an Arabic Quran, right? An Arabic recitation. And that means that this language and this recitation, these poems, are intrinsically very, very theologically rich and dense. Now, many people in the West, perhaps, also many Muslims, I think that the Quran is a rigorously legal text. But in fact, it is literally an assemblage of poetic verses that shape the soul and inform the mind as much as guide the will, direct the will of the believer. Of the roughly 6,000 verses in the Quran, only around 500 have the form of law, directly commanding or forbidding believers to do something or other. Indeed, the entire Quran has only about 200 verses directly commanding believers to pray, but 600 verses commanding believers to reflect, to ponder, and to analyze God's magnificence in nature, in plants, in stars, and in the solar system as a whole. This will, I hope, help us understand something of the context out of which the Iblis story emerges in the Quran. And it's important because the Quran will sometimes tell stories at different moments, repeatedly tell the same story, in order to uncover different nuances of the story for a particular larger message it wants to tell. The Quran, in fact, tells the story of Iblis several different times, each time offering different facets of the story. My favorite version, the version I think is most relevant for our purposes, is in the 7th surah. This is God speaking first. We created you, we formed you, then we commanded the angels, bow down before Adam, and they bowed. Not Iblis. He refused to be one of those who bow. God said, what prevented you from bowing down as I commanded you? And he, Iblis, said, I am better than he. You created me from fire and him from clay. God said, get you down from here. Here is no place for your arrogance. Get out. You are the lowest of creatures. But Iblis said, give me respite until the day they are raised. And God said, you have respite. Then Iblis said, because you have put me in the wrong, I shall lie in wait for them on your straight path. I will assault them from the front and the back, from their right and their left, nor will you find that most of them are grateful. God said, get out. You are disgraced and expelled. I swear I shall fill hell with you and all who follow you. Now, that's a long quote. Let me give you a little commentary on it. Let me tell you a little bit about it. In the Quranic stories, Iblis is asked by God to bow down, right? All the angels, all the spirits are told to bow down to Adam, to Adam. Now, the word bow down here in Arabic is the word sajad. That word is also the word used for the ritual prostration in Islamic prayer. In other words, at least on one meaning of the term, God is telling the angels to worship Adam. Iblis refuses to recognize Adam's theological supremacy. Right? Iblis doesn't do anything. This is important too. We'll come back to this. He doesn't do something. He simply doesn't bow. And in that act, he becomes the accuser, the rebel, the opponent, Shaitan, Satan. And from this rebellious refusal, all evil proceeds. He says, I will lay in wait for them everywhere on your straight path. And God says, you who were once high, now I am casting you down low. Right? It is precisely because Iblis is so high that he doesn't want to get lower than Adam. He doesn't want to lower himself in that way. So instead, what happens is, because he is too high for God, God casts him down. You see the kind of poetic paradoxes of this here. Well, understanding this event and understanding how the Quran describes it and the main traditions of interpreting these stories really casts a lot of light, interesting light, on Islamic understandings of evil and the relation between religious piety and moral rectitude. Think about Iblis's fall. Again, a little bit like Augustine. It has its reasons. Iblis has his motives, right? It seems inappropriate to Iblis that he should lower himself below something that was made of clay, since he was made of fire. Furthermore, another picture, another dimension of evil here. Iblis does not per se act. Iblis refuses to act. He does not bow down. And then, in his description of why he will now lie in wait for the good people of God, Iblis says, because you, God, brought me low. That is, Iblis blames God for making him go bad. Now, this gets at a couple different dimensions of evil in Islamic accounts that are worth noting. First of all, one paradoxical dimension of it. Evil is clearly something that is done by people, but it also can be seen as something that happens to them. At least many evil people, people who have done evil acts, often report their deeds as effectively things they had to do. They were compelled to do it, right? It's not their fault. They didn't mean to. Or they meant to, but they only meant it in the best description of the act. Effectively, then, action of this sort looks ambivalently like it was done, but also like it happened, like it didn't really have an agent, right? Furthermore, in the tradition, Satan himself, in the Islamic tradition, is only ambiguously a personal agent for Islamic thought. Sometimes Iblis appears as an agent, a person with desires and designs on humanity. The Quranic story we gave tells that perfectly. But at other times, Iblis, the satanic energies, seems more like an impersonal force, a power in the cosmos that humans experience as preying on their weakness and seducing them. But is it they who convince themselves that they are seduced, much in the same way that Iblis convinced himself in that fall that it was God who sent him down? Or do they seduce themselves into believing in their own seduction? Again, questions of responsibility are enormously complicated here, but they seem inescapable in these traditions. The idea here seems to be that Satan's character, as ambiguously personal, and the nature of satanic action, evil action, as ambiguously done or happening to a person, reveals something really deep about the nature of evil. That evil is both personal and impersonal at once. Intimate to you, something you do, and also something that you watch yourself doing, something that happens outside of you. And not to be too personal, but too psychological about this, but it seems to me that in a lot of accounts of people engaging in atrocities, people who were killing other people, people who were involved in genocides, people who were involved in murders, often what the perpetrators of these acts report is a kind of experience of a double consciousness, an awareness that they are doing these things, and an awareness, a part of their mind is fully engaged in the act of doing it, but another part of their mind is watching them do it. There's some kind of strange splitting that happens, at least in some really dramatic instances of truly horrific violence. As if we can't bear fully to be ourselves in those moments. This notion of Iblis's ambiguous agency and ambiguous personhood, it seems to me, get right at that in an important way. Furthermore, this helps us think about Iblis as saturating all dimensions of human existence. Satan is potentially everywhere and anywhere, in all of our deficiencies, large and small. Satan urges us to wash ourselves hastily and to ignore the cries of those being murdered. That's a Quranic example, right? That Satan is behind those moments when you feel impatient in engaging in the ritual ablutions you should undertake before prayer, right? The ritual washing you should undertake before prayer. And Satan is there, and Satan is also there when you ignore the cries of those you hear being murdered outside your house. That's an attempt to talk about a category of evil that in some ways captures both rabbinic concerns with the minutiae of ordinary life and also the kind of metaphysical concerns of some of the more dramatic pictures of Christianity. But most fundamentally of all on this account, remember, Iblis doesn't do anything. At no point, actually, does Iblis do anything until at the end when he says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to ruin things for you, God. Iblis is fundamentally and finally merely destructive, against God's creation, committed in the most literal way to nothing. Now, the majority tradition in Islamic thought thus gives us a powerful and stark depiction of Iblis as a failed creature, a once glorious being, now fallen into the uttermost darkness of soul. This is a catastrophe of a creature now, who now seeks desperately to drag others down into that same catastrophe. Not so much for company there, not so much because it'll be more pleasant when more people are in the pit, but in some sense to master them, to convince himself that he is able to master these fools. We'll see this desire for company in hell appear again in later thinkers, Christian thinkers like Anselm and Aquinas, Dante. Again and again, the idea of a communality to evil, which is a false communality, a false community. Furthermore, this picture of evil wants to avoid any sense of imagining, recognizing that this agent can serve God as a tempter, right? In other words, Satan on this account, Iblis, doesn't want to think that Satan is still working on God's team. In all these ways, this is not far from Christian understandings of Satan, though the explicit attention to the idea of evil as having its own reasons, which we've seen here, this explicit elaboration in the scriptures of the fall of Satan as motivated, is not present in Christian scriptures. But that's the majority view. That's the orthodox mainstream view in Islamic thought. But there is another tradition in Islamic thought on Iblis. We can call this the minority report, one represented by a number of Sufi mystics, right? These are some people who were very, very serious in their faith, but they manifested their faith in different ways than the mainstream of the orthodoxy found appropriate. And these mystics developed this different interpretation of these events, and their interpretation was carried forward as well by other later thinkers. These writers suggest that Iblis was, or perhaps is, in a certain way, the perfect monotheist, the one angel who would not bow down and worship Adam when God created him. This sounds crazy, especially in Islamic terms. Remember that in Islam, there is no God but God, right? Monotheism is the first and foremost virtue of the faithful. How could Satan be the perfect monotheist? Isn't being a monotheist good? Isn't it good, especially in Islam? That's all true. But the Sufis suggest that there is a way that monotheism can be taken too far, that it can become a kind of idolatry, and that the believer can become, in a certain sense, holier than thou. On one description of this account, then, Iblis could seem a tragic figure and a cautionary tale for those who value their own personal piety above all. Interestingly, in Judaism, actually, there are similar structures that can function as well. The law above all other laws is to preserve life. You can break the Sabbath, you can break the fast on Yom Kippur, you can break any number of rules in order to secure life in Jewish law. Securing the life of the world is a fundamental good. The Sufis are sort of saying that there's a way of appropriating Islamic law which denies the goodness of life. And that is, they say, deeply un-Islamic, but it is nonetheless a danger on this religious tradition. Similarly, in Christianity, of course, one of the most popular lines in the Reformation is the fact that even the devil knows Scripture. In other words, for all three of these traditions in different ways, the Sufi interpretation is paradigmatic of a particular moment. It is always possible, the traditions have to recognize, to misappropriate the faith. Simply being a believer is no guarantee of moral rectitude. In fact, the appearance of belief can itself be one of the best disguises for evil. Perhaps the best believer turns out to be Satan. That's a disquieting thought. For the Sufis, and for those who followed them in the Islamic tradition, this interpretation of Iblis is part of a larger mystical worldview where all is in God's hands. God's will for Iblis is not violated by Iblis's refusal to bow before humanity. God's will is rather fulfilled by it. This interpretation insinuates, that is, a complication into the main story that offers an even deeper insight into the nature of evil as the faith professes it. Evil's origin here is not completely irrational, nor simply a matter of excessive self-love or a rude sense of pride. Evil is due to a misplaced but plausible sense of right value. Iblis, on this account, cannot worship what is below him or what is other than God. And he is offended that God has commanded spiritual beings to prostrate themselves, to worship material ones, and that God has commanded anyone to worship anything other than God. Right? It's precisely Iblis's prim theological propriety that is the problem. Now, Iblis is driven by a set of motives that we can see, at least on their first look, to be noble and worthy. Right? This is not irrational, not a rebellion. It's grounded on a reasonable, though misplaced, it turns out, assessment of the right order of values. Now, it's pretty clear that the Sufis were led to this view by some difficulties that they had living among the more orthodox believers of either the Sunni or the Shia variety. Now, Sunni and Shia are the two main branches of Islam, much as Christians have Protestants, Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox. The Sufis were often terribly persecuted, and so had good reason to grow to resent the more orthodox, the more theologically self-righteous. And the Sufis, after all, would, in their ecstasies, engage in some relatively wild theological speculations of the sort that others would find troubling. So certainly, their views of Iblis and their interpretation of the story were shaped by what they saw as the demonic suffering they suffered at the hands of their more orthodox neighbors. But I think there's a real insight here for all three Abrahamic faiths on evil. It's something of what I said before. The insight is that you have to think of a way in which your own tradition could not just enable, but maybe aggravate, amplify evil. It is precisely the story of Iblis as a believer who has gone wrong because of his belief that is the most powerful thing about that counter story, and the thing I think that all three traditions could benefit from enormously. Now, as with the discussion of Rabbinic Judaism's thought about evil, this account of Iblis, the Orthodox account and the Minority Report, they offer significantly different pictures of evil from what we have so far in our mostly Christian account seen. Here, evil appears to be a moral choice, a decision for one good over another, not a completely irrational rebellion, right? Not the sort of thing that Augustine talks about as lacking all reason. And it raises this question, especially the Sufi Minority Report interpretation raises this question. Might evil itself be, at least sometimes, prompted by genuine, real good? That's the question that we should end this lecture on. We'll turn next to some Christian scholastics who think about these questions in deep, again, though silent conversation with some of the rabbinic and Islamic views we've thought about from within the stream of thinking inaugurated by Augustine. So we'll turn to those next.